Hi everybody, Steve here at Oak Hill Cemetery, as you can see from the sign there. Wow, look at this cool old building. Now this is San Jose. Chapel of the Roses, wow. Look at that building, wow. Now this looks like a pretty big cemetery. I thought this was an old historic cemetery. I didn't realize it was going to be modern. Alcohol is prohibited at all times. You know, it's funny the signs you see in cemeteries these days. We have a lot of people come to the cemeteries to drink and party, I think. Well, obviously we do, or they wouldn't have all these signs. I'm here today to visit the final resting place of someone who was murdered back in 1933, and he was only 22 years old. His Find a Grave memorial page had a picture, but no information about how to find his crypt. I mean, the photo I could tell was a crypt, and I could tell it was square rather than long. And that was about it. And I knew that he died back in 1933, so I assumed it had to be one of the older mausoleums. So I drove all over the cemetery looking for an older mausoleum, could not find one. And then I discovered that attached to his Find a Grave memorial page was his brother's. And on his brother's, it said that he was laid to rest in the Great Mausoleum. So I thought, okay, there must be a great mausoleum here somewhere. And as I drove and drove around, I couldn't find it. And then I just happened to look up, and I saw this beautiful old historic mausoleum, at least it looked like a mausoleum, on the side of the hill. And I thought, well, how in the heck do I get up there? So I just kept driving around. This is a large memorial park. And I kept driving around until I finally saw a road that looked like it went up the hill. Drove up, and sure enough, I found the Great Mausoleum, and it is unlocked. And so it's fairly large, but since I had a picture, I had an idea. I just thought I would just wander down the aisles and see if I might be able to find his final resting place. Well, I did luck out because the style of nameplate that he has, I was only able to find in two of the corridors. Now, the corridors are pretty large, but on his brother's, it did say that he was in the poinsettia corridor. So I just walked around in those two long corridors. I stayed on the lower level. There is a second floor, but I thought, well, let me just try the lower level first. And I saw poinsettia corridor, and then a funny thing happened. I found his final resting place and his entire family's final resting place behind this really large ladder. And in fact, there's two ladders that are hooked together, and they're not movable. I thought, you know, what are the odds? And I thought, well, actually that has happened to me a couple of times before. And those are the only two ladders I saw anywhere in the Great Mausoleum. So, you know, sometimes that just happens, but at least it wasn't completely blocking his name. So I was able to get a picture and his name in a video. So I added a GPS to his Find a Grave memorial page, but it said it was having a hard time doing that. And so hopefully it added the GPS in the right place. It was probably having difficulty because there wasn't great reception inside of this mausoleum with very thick cement walls, I'm guessing. So Brooke's story is an especially sad one. Brook Hart was the son of a wealthy family. They owned Hart's department store here in San Jose, and so he had the good luck to be born into a wealthy family, which also turned out to be very bad luck. He was kidnapped when he was only 22 years old by Thomas Harold Thurman, who was 27 years old, and John Holmes, who was 29 years old. He was held for a very large ransom, at that time anyway, but for whatever reason, the kidnappers decided to go ahead and kill him anyway. I don't know if it was accidental or on purpose or what, but they bashed in his head, and then they threw his body into the San Francisco Bay. And it wasn't found until 17 days later. Thankfully, the kidnappers were caught, and they confessed to the kidnapping and the killing, and they were locked up awaiting sentencing or trial, I'm not sure. But this was 1933, and justice was sometimes a little bit different back then, a little bit faster. Apparently, outraged by the crime, hundreds of vigilantes had gathered outside of the jailhouse and demanded justice. They were so outraged by this crime that they stormed the police department, dragged the two kidnappers out into the town square, and with thousands of onlookers, they hung them. But before hanging them, they stripped them of their clothing to hang them naked. Hanging them wasn't enough. They also wanted to humiliate them publicly. After they were hung, their photographs appeared on the front page of the local newspaper.
The photographs are very graphic and very disturbing, so I'm not going to show them, but they just popped up when I Googled this story. Everything about this story is pretty shocking.
So I guess that's what you call instant justice. Back then, people were still outraged by things like this. Today, I think so many of us have just become callous to the most horrific crimes that something like this probably just wouldn't happen. I mean, maybe it would somewhere, but the justice system is so different that I don't think that could happen. It would be very unlikely here in the US for that to happen in most towns and cities in the country. But back then, apparently, it was still possible, and this isn't the first case I've heard where something like that's happened. I thought that was pretty interesting. I certainly wouldn't advocate that. Quite often people are arrested who aren't guilty. I mean, that does happen. So there's good reason not to allow vigilantism. I mean, people get very emotional and rightly so, when something like this happens, but mistakes can be made and you might not always get the right person. I was curious where his killers were buried. John Holmes was cremated and his whereabouts are unknown, but according to his Find a Grave memorial, Thomas Harold Thurman is buried in this very cemetery, the same cemetery where Brooke Leopold Hart is laid to rest. Now, his gravesite is unmarked, or at least that's what it says on his Find a Grave memorial page, and I'm guessing they probably figured if they put a marker with the anger and outrage, they probably would have dug up his body, and who knows what they would have done with it. Maybe they would have tossed it into the San Francisco Bay like they did to Brooke.
This week, I want to thank my newest Patreon supporters, Kristen Wells, Kimberly Catledge, and Matthew Philpott. Thank you, Kristen, Kimberly, and Matthew, for your very kind and generous donations to my channel. They really mean a lot and do help make future trips like this possible.
So how many of you do remember Brook Hart in this story? If not, then I'm glad that I brought it to you today so you can remember him. And hopefully through the magic of YouTube and Find a Grave and all of us out there visiting cemeteries all over the world, innocent victims like Brooke will be remembered forever. Until our next trip to the cemetery together. Thanks for sharing the memories, everybody.